So the Belgian style of colonization is probably one of the worst examples of colonization. And again, divide and rule, you have that in Rwanda and Burundi, purposely dividing the Tutsis and the Hutus, almost making them enemies. The Belgians were very, very good at that. They've got a lot to answer for in both Congo and Rwanda, Burundi area, where of course these ethnic tensions continue to this day.
I am an African.
We just want to begin by understanding what exactly was this conference about, and why was it necessary? Why was it necessary to have this conference in the first place?
Okay, we've got to bear in mind it was not just a single conference. There were Berlin conferences, plural. One in 1878, for instance. The European powers wanted to find out how to go ahead after the wars involving Turkey. So what you had was the use of Berlin as a major place for coming to agreements. And what the European powers wanted to do in 1884-85, literally Christmas 84 to New Year 85, was to find a way forward over Africa that did not involve them going to war. In other words, Europe had had so many years of war. The last thing it wanted was yet another war over a place which was still, to a certain extent, an unknown quantity.
Yeah.
What was a known quantity was that the Congo was very rich. So it began as a conference centered on the Congo, but then spread out into the wider continent. What are we going to do about this wider continent? Not that much was known about the rest of Africa. And so what they proceeded by way of decision-making was, look, you've got a presence here, you've got missionaries here, you've got traders here, we've got traders here, we've got missionaries here. We've already got minor spheres of influence. So a lot of the map of Africa was basically divided up according to spheres of influence. And where they couldn't agree, they simply drew a straight line, which is why the map of Africa has got so many straight lines. Now, the political cartoonists of the day were following this. And so you literally had political cartoons in the European newspapers of European leaders dividing up Africa as if it were a Christmas pudding. That's what they were doing, basically, having Christmas dinner, deciding the fate of an entire continent. But basically, they decided to do this without going to war. Everyone wanted to have their share. Not everyone got their share. The Italians were left out of the picture, for instance. But basically, most of the European powers got a piece of Africa.
And it's quite ironic that they had to stop themselves from going to war over a continent that wasn't really theirs. And also another thing that you mentioned was the boundaries, the borders of Africa. It's quite cartoonish. Being from Zambia, I think we have very good examples of how literally straight lines and the people on those straight lines don't really care much about those borders. I went to sort of where my mom comes from, her native village, and you could literally see Malawi. Like, you could just literally point at a tree and say, "That's Malawi," and the trees don't look any different. The people don't speak any different language. It's exactly the same. And on more serious note, you have a lot of sort of issues that have to this day still emanate from those boundaries. And just to get a picture of who was at the Berlin conference, of course, many people say, there's that famous map that they have that's like pink for Britain, and there's like I forgot what color it was for France, but there were quite a number of colonial powers there. I think Russia was also there as well. Almost all of the major European powers, and even the United States as well.
Yeah, but not all of them got pieces of Africa. The major colonial powers that emerged from Berlin were, in fact, Britain, as you say, France, Portugal, Belgium. We got a very great deal, particularly when it came to the Congo. The Germans, East Africa, what we now call Namibia. The Russians, nothing. The Americans, nothing. They weren't interested in being colonial powers, but the
Mm-hmm.
European powers certainly were. Basically, they'd brought themselves to a standstill in Europe, so they've thought that the way of going forward in the world on a competitive basis was controlling other parts of the world.
Yeah.
They couldn't control all of Europe, but they could control other parts of the world. And so the scramble for Africa was on, literally starting 1884, 85, over Christmas and New Year celebrations. And as I said, the political cartoonists just had a field day with Africa being carved up like a Christmas pudding.
Yeah. And we when I was growing up, at least historically, they were either the three G's and the three C's, so in terms of the reasons for colonization. And the 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 three G's stood for, I think, God, glory, and gold. And then the three C's stood for Christianity, commerce, and civilization. To what extent could you just like sort of expand on that? To what extent are these true, and what really were the main reasons for wanting to dominate other parts? Was it trade? Was it simply, Rudyard Kipling's white man's burden that we need to civilize the African people and blah 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 and all of those things? What was the real
So,
reason? Yeah.
well, there's no real reason. It was a conglomeration of different reasons, many of which were justifications afterwards. For instance, in terms of God and Christianity, don't forget the Islamic powers had been in Africa beforehand. So you had a very, very strange, as it were, realization that
Yeah.
what you had in Africa were different belief systems, not just those that were indigenous to the continent, and a
Mhm.
very great deal of Islam as well, and a very great deal of difference in terms of styles of rulership and African government.
Yeah.
Some kingship states, for instance, others more of a flat line, consultative way of doing things. So they didn't come up with a common template as to how to handle these things. They didn't really know, except for the Congo, just how rich different parts of the continent were.
Yeah.
They knew that there were resources in Ghana, for instance, because of cocoa, because of gold, in fact. But that's not because of the Europeans discovering that. That's because the Ashanti Kingdom in
Yeah.
Ghana was already trading on the London stock market. They were
Wow.
basically going ahead themselves with their own form of indigenous capitalism
Yeah.
integrating with global capitalism. And so they saw that there was a market there they could take over. But
Yeah.
for most other countries, they didn't know about these things. They only discovered most of the minerals in Africa, apart from the Congo, afterwards. So a lot of this is justification after the fact. Now, missionaries, of course, God
Missionaries.
had a
Yeah.
lot, had a lot to do with it in terms of justifying to parliaments and to governments why they were doing this.
Yeah.
Because don't forget, what you had in Europe was already a history of colonialism, not all of which had gone well.
Within
In
Europe.
America, well, not just within Europe, but in other parts of the world. For instance, what you had in the War of Independence in the Americas,
Yeah.
United States of America, basically the European powers lost out on that as America in 1776 declared itself independent.
Right. Yeah.
What you had similarly with Spain and Portugal in South America, with Simon Bolivar, called the Liberator,
Yeah.
gaining independence for all of these countries in South America. A lot of the colonial experience had for the European powers gone sour. And of course, what you had was concentration not so much on Africa, but a concentration on India, and a very great deal of anxiety as to how to deal with China.
Yeah.
We can't control China, but can we subjugate them?
So even then,
No,
China was still a bit of a threat.
not a threat at all. It was a decadent society. They hadn't moved with the times. The Japanese had, Chinese
Right.
hadn't, but it was too big to control. So basically, can we subjugate them so they'll do what we want them to do without our having to get in there and govern them
Yeah.
ourselves? And so when they came to Africa, this was just another stage of the whole colonial enterprise. As I said, not all of the colonial enterprise had gone well. Now, to a certain extent, it had gone well in India for the British, but there they used a certain model of government. In other words, when we talk about divide and rule,
Yeah.
it was applied in India
Mm.
first. They made deals with the local princes, the local rajas, okay? And basically, you guys cooperate with us. We let you stay in power, but
Yeah.
basically you're in power on your behalf, but also on our behalf.
I
And
see.
so using as a kingship states as a form of colonial rule, they were able to take that to a certain extent to Africa, but not to all parts of it. So that's why you have different forms of colonial government in Africa.
Hmm.
In countries which had a far more flat-line consultative way of dealing with things, like Zambia, for instance, there are
Right.
72 different groups of people, all with their own way of dealing with things. And very few of them actually kingship states. I mean, the Lozi people, the Tonga people are kingship states, for instance. The Bemba people are kingship states. But people who speak Chinyanja are not kingship states. So you have that same difference in Zimbabwe. The Shona are not as much of a kingship state as the Ndebele.
Yeah.
So you have different styles that the British and the French had to get used to. Now, insofar as the British found some kingship states, like Uganda, like
Yeah. Uganda
Nigeria,
Kingdom. Yeah.
that's right, they applied the Indian model,
Mm.
divide and rule, get the local kings and princes to
Hmm.
work on your behalf, give
Yeah.
them titles, sir this, sir that, handing them out.
Long
Now,
door. Yeah.
the French got more of that than the British. They
Okay.
had access after Berlin to huge, not just kingship states, but to empire states, like the great Mali Empire, one of the
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
situations of civilization, as the Europeans like to call it, but genuinely, as it were,
The
developed.
Timbuktu.
Yeah, Timbuktu, one of the great universities and libraries of the world. It ranked with Alexandria, it ranked with Ephesus, the legendary places of learning. That was very, very much associated with Mali, site of great poetry, great learning, great Quranic, Islamic learning, and
Hmm.
cities. All of these things we normally associate with the so-called civilization. The French got more of that than the British, for
British. Yeah.
instance. So the French model tends to be quite different to the British model. What happened was that since there were fewer kingship states outside of Nigeria, a bit of Ghana, Uganda, the British basically developed, as it were, this style of settler colonialism. We go and then we rule them and we own the land.
Hmm.
Okay. It's caused lots of problems, of course,
Yeah.
huge problems to this very, very day. And they did it also on a corporate model. So when you talk about Cecil Rhodes in
Oh yeah.
South Africa,
Yeah.
spreading up to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and of course, what was northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, as well as Malawi. This was corporate colonialism on behalf of the crown.
That was
So
the
they were in
British
there for,
South African Company. Yeah.
that's right, they were in there for the money.
Yeah.
And they were allowed to do that because they were able to basically provide revenue to the empire. They paid revenues into the British government, and so they were allowed to basically develop as they wished. And the whole idea of having all of these territories, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, that's a pretty big chunk of Southern Africa. And Rhodes had this ambition, this dream of what he called the Cape to Cairo route, the road Cape to Cairo, which is why the main road in Lusaka to this day is
Indeed.
still called Cairo Road.
Yeah.
It's meant to be part
Legacy.
of this great North Road. It's all meant to join up finally
Yeah.
in Cairo and then join up the continent. They never did that. The Chinese are doing it now, but the British failed in
Yeah.
completing the Cairo Road. And that would have given them, as it were, control of a continent, not just on military terms, but in economic terms, because everything would be joined up. They also recognized that if you were going to govern Africa, you had to have communications. Thus, the road was very, very important. And
Hmm.
that's why colonialism became very fragmented. They couldn't join it up.
Yeah.
And so you have all these individual countries that never got together. They would have gotten together in a different way to what they were before
Yeah.
colonialism. But even that would have been problematic, because in what way would they have gotten together if they'd wanted to be like before? Because basically, roughly speaking, you've got 2,000 different ethnicities in Africa, 2,000 languages, not dialects, languages. Now, obviously, there are cognate words that go backwards and forwards between languages, just like there are between English and French and Spanish, for instance.
Yeah.
You know a little bit of one of those languages, you could read the football pages in the other countries. We all know that Paris Saint-Germain won the European Cup.
Yeah, big news now.
You can read that in the French newspapers, even if you're not a great French speaker. But that doesn't mean that the languages are the same. There are cognate words that go backwards and forwards. But 2,000 different languages in Africa, which means 2,000 different ways of thinking. Because the way you speak determines to a huge extent the way that you are able to perceive the world. That's why Ngugi wrote Decolonizing the Mind.
Yeah,
for God's sake, we start using our own language, because otherwise we're thinking like a white man. If we use our own language, at least we can start thinking like ourselves. We could be more
I think that was in the book Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
That was absolutely his book, this most famous
Kenyan
book.
literature icon.
That's right. And of course, he just recently died.
Yes.
He wrote great novels, as well as great books of essays, as well as Decolonizing the Mind, which basically established the entire movement towards decolonization, not just as a political act, but as an act of authenticity. Can we be our own people? Can we have our own minds? And so that's become a major, major movement that's spread out from Africa, from Ngugi. In other words, what you've got is after colonialism, the tables are turning slightly. And, decolonization is the buzzword right now, and picked up by the Chinese, for instance, and by other people. They all want to be free of being dominated by Western influences. Not do away with them. The world is global. We've got to live with each other. But, basically to be able to state our own position in the world on our own terms, with some basic reference to our own cultures and our own histories. So Africa is doing that now. So what you've got, 1884-85, the Berlin Conference, today, 2025, is actually a huge movement in history, which has happened with Africa at the center. So, whatever the colonial powers tried, it didn't completely work. It worked for a short time.